And that's why then banks come in to support the MSMEs. And if you recall, for the last 1.5 years, we have been under the impact of the COVID pandemic. And the COVID pandemic has had a major impact on the economy, but more importantly, the MSMEs have been most affected. And the MSMEs not only have their risk perception been elevated, but also the access to finance has seriously been curtailed. And so as a banking sector, we're trying to ensure that the MSMEs, one, they don't feel left out. They still have an opportunity to access finance. And banks have come up with various proposals and options in terms of availing credit to the MSMEs, which are so badly in need of credit to be able to recover from the ravages of the COVID-19.
Great. And Habil, you've actually touched on something that I wanted us to dwell a bit on. You mentioned the fact that earlier on in the summit, there was the launch of the Blended Finance Partnership, which is a joint partnership between KBA, the Financial Sector Deepening Kenya, and the Kenya Climate Innovation Center. And even as you talk about, access to credit being such a big thing for MSMEs, which was even further heightened by the pandemic, I'd like you to talk to us a little more about this blended finance partnership. What was the rationale around it, and how is it really going to work in really buffering and giving MSMEs some sort of reprieve when it comes to access to credit?
This is a very innovative kind of partnership that we did come, as you have mentioned. There is a Kenya Climate Innovation Center, there is the Financial Sector Deepening, and the KBA. Now, under the Kenya Climate Innovation Center, there are a number of startups, many of whom are, of course, MSMEs that have, in a way, been enabled to kick off their operations using some startup support from the Kenya Climate Innovation Center. Many of them are operating in the green economy space. Now, the partnership that brings into the arena the KBA together with the Kenya Climate Innovation Center and the FSD then tries to ensure that there is a form of blended finance where we have got a mixture, sort of, to speak, where they can then scale up and move on from the initial startup stage to then be able to access credit from the banking sector once they're able to kick off their operations on a more scalable kind of size. So the blended finance partnership is a mechanism through which we see MSMEs being able to spring up from the level of almost being informal to formalizing the operations and therefore being able to access the finance that is available from the banking sector where there is a need for some form of formalization. And this is a way of supporting these MSMEs to move over from the informal kind of arrangement into the formalized arrangement, where they're now able to not only access funding from the banking sector, but the hope is that they'll even be able to scale up and eventually be available to, or rather to avail, to access credit from the capital markets even, where you can think of, for example, the IPO, when you want to go public. You can think of other forms of credit available in the capital markets and not just from the banking sector. So the banking sector will be more or less like a platform to enable them scale up into more, sizable availability of capital.
Dr. Habil, staying with the Inua Biashara Summit, this is the second time it's actually being held. Now, if we're usually when you go through some of these annual summits, usually you'll take some key lessons, some take homes that will inform then the conversation. What have we been, if we're to draw from past experiences from the last summit going into this one, what would you say are maybe the glaring gaps that came up from the last one that informed interventions or even the conversation that's going to happen this time around with this summit?
If you recall, when we had the last summit, which was in 2019, the environment in which you're operating in at that point in time was the fact that there had been interest caps in the banking sector. So effectively, MSMEs were not able to access credit because banks were unable to price the credit for this specific segment. Now, the summit was being held at the time when the caps had just been removed, and therefore we were very hopeful that now with the caps removed, banks will be able to price credit and therefore start seeing credit flowing into the MSME. So we are at that point very hopeful and preparing ourselves for the resumption of flow of credit to the MSMEs. Then came COVID, and all our hopes were then dashed. The very MSMEs that were very hopeful of the resurgence of credit were the ones who are most affected by the COVID-19. So now we are coming into this summit, not only having our hopes that were then in 2019 dashed, but also other challenges having come into place, especially with the COVID-19. Now, banks have tried their best given the circumstances, and we can mention just a few of the things that they have been able to put in place. For instance, with the support of the central bank, banks were able to restructure some of the facilities, most of whom are the MSMEs, to give them some breathing space. They're also able to extend a little bit of liquidity from the liquidity that was availed through the central bank's for example, the credit guarantee scheme that has been put in place. So a number of things have been put in place, but that's not enough.
Right.
And we do expect that there is a lot more that banks will need to work on to be able to ensure that the MSMEs are accessing credit as expected. And in any case, it's the SMEs that are our hope in terms of the economic recovery. We know that it's the private sector that will be the engine for the economic recovery out of the ravages of the pandemic. So if the MSMEs are not supported, we obviously will have a very difficult time coming out of these economic challenges that you have had because of the COVID-19. So banks are therefore trying to, using the trade show, they're trying to showcase the products and services that either they have put in place or they're working on to ensure that there is a continuous flow of credit from the banks into the MSMEs, hopefully to be able to then recover from the ravages of the COVID-19.
And in the same breath, Dr. Habil, you've rightly mentioned the interventions that have been put in place by banks, but in as much as those interventions have been there, there's still more that needs to be done. We've also seen a situation where individually, on a personal level, financial institutions have come up with products directly addressed at MSMEs, and maybe for some reason there's a very big information gap whereby maybe sometimes information doesn't get out there, and so when it comes to the MSME actually tapping into that product, it's not as effective. My question with the Inua Biashara Summit that brings together this financial institution, what kind of role do such synergies play in terms of effectiveness and actually even achieving the desired outcome in terms of the product range that's put out there by financial institutions? How effective is that, and what do such innovative synergies play in achieving what's intended to be achieved?
Yeah, I think the critical thing, one of the things that you have clearly highlighted in your question is the fact that we need to work on awareness creation. And I think one of the critical things in this summit is the awareness creation, whereby we're bringing various partners onto the table so that we can be able to discuss and share information that is currently possibly not as available as we would have expected it to. One good example, for example, is we know that MSMEs have got one of the challenges, which is availability of the appropriate collateral to be able to secure their funding from the various credit providers, including banks. Now, the challenge with MSMEs not having the conventional collateral, which is land or buildings, is well known. And we already have some arrangements where we know that these MSMEs have got alternative collateral, not land and building, but they could have, for example, equipment They could have fittings within the offices. They could have some of them, depending on which segment of production they are. They could be, for example, having agricultural assets. The crop can itself be a collateral. So there is what we call the movable assets registry, which if the borrowers are aware and they would not lack various assets that they could use as collateral when they don't have the traditional land and building, including intellectual property, which is evident in a number of these MSMEs. They have got a lot of intellectual property. Most of it could actually be collateralized through this registry. So at this summit, we hope to create awareness of such, because a number of MSMEs are simply not using advantage of that because they don't know it exists. Or if they know that it exists, they don't know how to go about it, to use the few assets they have and use them as collateral. Now, we hope that with this summit, by bringing the parties together, some of this information can then be shared, because it's not like these SMEs don't have the knowledge. They don't have the assets. It's just that they don't have the knowledge of the fact that they could use what they have to overcome the challenges that they meet when they access the banks. The other one is, for example, capacity building. Within the banking sector, we have got what we call the Inua SME Enterprise Development Program, where we are trying to capacity build the MSMEs by bringing their capabilities up to the expectations of the lenders. Now, a number of them don't know the existence of such a program. So by coming together on such a summit, such information is shared out, and with the SMEs aware of what there is, are then able to leverage on them to be able to access the credit that's available.
Brilliant. I feel like you've really encompassed everything that we need to know about the Inua Biashara Summit. But in summation, even as we wind up, as an MSME, and I know this has been a week-long event that really ends tomorrow, what would you say have been the key highlights? What kind of value? And as an SME, why would this summit have been very important to tap into as we wind up?
I think one of the key take-homes for the MSMEs from this summit is the fact that there is a lot that is being done, but so many of the MSMEs are not aware of what's happening. They're not aware of what has been done by the various parties. Central Bank has done a lot to enable banks to be able to facilitate the MSMEs to access credit, or even to just be able to survive through the ravages of the COVID-19. So things like, for example, their loans being restructured without banks having to reclassify those assets, liquidity being availed to the banks, things like, for example, what the National Treasury has been able to do by creating a scheme that then de-risks the MSMEs to be able to access credit from the particular financial institutions that have been allowed to participate in the scheme. I think the good thing about, or rather take home from this summit, will be the fact that now the MSMEs will now be aware of what has been done by the various parties and how they can then be able to take advantage of them to access credit to be able to survive through this period.
Well, that was Dr. Habil Olaka, the CEO of Kenya Bankers Association, just really taking us through the week-long Inua Biashara Summit that kicked off on the 22nd of June and will end on 29th of June. As an MSME, there was so much that went on. There's so much products that banks are putting out there. Thank you very much for making time, Dr. Olaka. Well, that's where we wrap it up today on Metropole Business Center. Thank you very much for watching. Remember, you can be a part of the conversation by sending your feedback to our social media handles at Metropole TV KE on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Enjoy the rest of your viewing.